It's Wednesday, the 7th of July 2021, and it's 7 p.m. I'm Sean Bloor, and welcome to this week's edition of Resistance TV. Chris is taking a long-awaited break this week. However, we are joined tonight by Rod Driver, our resident academic, with his 5th episode of The Elephant in the Room. Rod will be talking about the corrupt financial system, and later we'll be joined by Lizzie, who is manning the YouTube chat room tonight, and she'll be taking your questions and comments to put to Rod after his presentation. So if you want to ask anything from Rod, please drop your questions in the chat, and any comments are always welcome. So good evening, Rod.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
Hi, thank you for joining us again. Following from the financial crisis that began in 2007, it became clear that banks were engaged in a huge range of criminal and unethical activities: mis-selling, rigging markets, money laundering, tax evasion, subprime mortgages, ripping off customers, and fraud on a massive scale. These crimes have not gone away, and the activities of the banks are as fraudulent as ever. The financial system is a clear example of an industry that is rotten to the core and is no longer fit for purpose. So, Rod, over to you.
Well, that was a great introduction. So I would hope that everyone, except perhaps the very youngest viewers, will remember that back in 2007, 2008, we had an enormous financial crisis, and that was then followed by many years of what was labeled austerity, where we had very big decreases in government spending, and it created sort of catastrophic outcomes for many of us. And this wasn't just in Britain. This started in America, and then it touched many parts of the world. So the financial system is this sort of huge thing that most of the time doesn't get talked about, but it's kind of always there behind the scenes. And people come into contact with it when they need a mortgage, and everyone has a bank account and so on. And it's there, it's behind the scenes with everything. So if I talk about corporate crime in the weapons industry, or I talk about corporate crime in the medicines industry, then that happens in kind of selected areas. But the banks are engaged in all of it. And unfortunately, what people realized during and after the crisis was that a great deal of what they do is either completely criminal, or in a reasonable society, we would say that it's criminal, but it's defined as just unethical at the moment. So I'll talk a bit about the different ways in which that works, and then we can do some questions and answers at the end. So prior to 2007, the financial system in Britain and America had grown enormously, and almost half of American corporate profits were in banking prior to 2007. So there's a huge amount of money being made through the banking system. And this had come about because from approximately the 1980s, we'd had completely inadequate regulation of the banks. So older viewers will remember an event in the mid-1980s called Big Bang, where banking went from being this very pleasant gentleman's agreement type of system to being a very cutthroat, competitive American style system. And things have gone downhill since there. So if we look specifically at the crisis and what we learned then, and then we'll talk more widely. So the crisis was triggered by what are called subprime mortgages. So people were lent money that they couldn't possibly afford to repay. And the people making the loans said to these borrowers, oh, don't worry about the fact that it seems expensive to repay. We'll just remortgage in a couple of years. We'll start it off cheap and it'll be fine. And so it was lots and lots of lies. Excuse me. So if the bank had made a loan and then it carried the risk, that would cause problems for the bank. But in fact, the banks were very clever. They knew that a lot of these loans were going to go bust. They wouldn't be repaid. So they thought, let's sell these loans, these mortgages, on to somebody else, some other sucker. So they introduced a process called securitization. Don't worry about the technical terms. It just means that you bunch lots and lots of mortgages together, and then you chop them up and sell them to investors. And these are incredibly complicated. And the bank said, oh yeah, these are safe, these will be fine. They got the credit ratings agencies, which is another group of organizations who are meant to tell people about how safe or how risky an investment is. And the agencies said, oh, yeah, these are very safe. They gave them very good ratings. Lots of organizations invested in them, so pension funds invested in them. But it turned out everybody had been lying. And what happened was eventually large numbers of these mortgages could not be repaid. And then all the people who bought these mortgages expecting to be repaid money year after year after year, they lost lots of money. And in fact, the banks had come up with another way of doing a fraudulent activity and making money on it. They knew that the investments they had sold to their clients would not be repaid. They created yet another type of investment that enabled them to bet against their own clients. So there's deliberately huge amounts of complexity, opacity. Nobody really knew what the contents of these investments were. So it was impossible for anybody to really understand them. Even the banks themselves didn't really understand them. And eventually when the bubble bursts, people lose money, but there was a house price crash. And so lots of people went into what's called negative equity. So that means the house is worth less than the mortgage. And so the banks want to repossess the property. Banks were losing money hand over fist. They stopped lending to each other, so they couldn't lend to businesses. So businesses were going bust. There were repossessions, job losses, and all sorts of issues. And various senior people in banks have been interviewed about what was going on during all of this time. And somebody in Goldman Sachs, which is one of the big American banks, it was one of the worst offenders, although they were all of the big banks were behaved pretty awfully during this period. And they described their clients as Muppets to be ripped off. So basically, the whole banking system saw its main way to make bigger profits as just ripping off customers. And various experts have said the regulators, who should have been able to stop this, actually, they knew what was going on. And in fact, they knew how to stop it, but they chose not to. Okay, so the government actually could easily have done things very much earlier and stepped in to stop this, but it chooses not to because there's so much lobbying and so on in terms of the banks fund politicians, and so the politicians do regulations that the banks like. And so the main kind of crimes or frauds that we've discovered the banks do would include mis-selling. So some people will be familiar with what's called the PPI scandal. That's the personal insurance scandal. Many people were sold insurance policies that they would never be able to claim on. And eventually that got found out and banks have had to pay back billions of pounds in compensation. Other banks have rigged markets. So Barclays was fined a huge amount of money for rigging one of the main markets, which is called LIBOR, which is about interest rates and so on. And other banks have been fined for funding terrorism. They've been fined for helping other companies do tax evasion and accounting fraud. And they've done tax evasion and accounting fraud themselves and so on. So, in fact, I came across an astonishing statistic whilst researching this, that in the last 20 years, the world's banks have been fined a total of 330 billion US dollars. Okay, many, many times greater than any other industry in the world. In fact, probably more than all other industries put together. So it is the most fraudulent industry in the world. And one of the things that you'll notice if you ever look into this is that individuals in the banking system are almost never prosecuted. There are one or two exceptions, but it's very, very rare. And so what people who tried to work out what was going on realized, so I'm going to jump back a little step. So the banks had basically gone bust and governments didn't want them to go bust. So they stepped in and they did the bailouts. Now the bailouts were much bigger than people realized. So I don't have the numbers for the UK, but in America, the total size of the bailout was $7 trillion. Once you're up into the trillions, it's an incomprehensible amount of money, and it's just you cannot really understand how much it is. So astonishing amounts of money needed to bail out the banks. And the strange thing is, the way the government provided money to the banks is that over the next few years, much of this money ended up in the pockets of the rich because it maintained stock market prices and housing prices. So it turned out that in the 5 years after the crisis, the richest 1,000 people in Britain had actually doubled their wealth, whilst everybody else was suffering through austerity. So there were the cuts to all sorts of government services. So one of the things that you discover when you look at the banking system, it is actually constructed in a slightly strange way, where you've got built-in conflicts of interest. That means that people in these companies can actually gain something, they benefit from doing something very unethical. So in the case of the crisis, they were betting against their own clients. Now, anybody who studied history will know that right back in 1929, something very similar happened. It was documented very clearly in America, but actually it also happened in other countries too. There was an enormous crisis caused by bankers being able to do pretty much whatever they wanted to do, whatever frauds, whatever scams, and it was incredibly destabilizing for the whole economy. And eventually there's a crash and everybody suffers. Now, what they did in America after the 1929 crisis was they realized you can't have a banking system where a bank makes money by screwing its customers. So banking has sort of two parts. There's what's called retail banking or consumer banking. There's basic loans and saving, and you can do that in a way that's very, very safe. And then there's another section to it, which is a kind of gambling system, and it's called speculation, but speculation's just another word for gambling. Now, if that part of the banking system is kept separate from the retail banking, then it might be okay. And if it's kept small, then it might be okay. But what happened was it's not separate and it's not small. In fact, the gambling, and we'll talk about it a bit more in a minute, now dwarfs the main system. So it's incredibly destabilizing. Now, one of the things that that happened during this crisis was that the executives were paying themselves astronomical bonuses even when they were causing the banks to fail. And you realize that the pay had nothing to do with performance. It never does. That's just a kind of charade, a myth. Okay, pay is always about executives knowing how to extract ever more wealth from the system. So after 1929, in America, they separated out the different parts of banking, and that kept the system stable for about 50 years. But then gradually, because companies lobbied the government to change the rules, the separation of banking was disappeared. Banks were brought back together again, and that's how they became bigger and bigger and more unstable all over again. Well, this time around, we had the opportunity, if we wanted to separate out the banks after the 2007 crisis, but the regulators have decided they don't want to do it. The bankers are too influential in politics, and so we still have the same completely unstable system that we had just over a decade ago. And in fact, it's slightly worse than it was then. The biggest problems haven't been fixed. There's been some little tinkering at the edges. If you watch a news program, they'll talk about banks having more reserves than they used to have. But in fact, the same fundamental problems still exist. And banks are now much bigger than they were. And many experts have said they're actually so big and so complex that they cannot be regulated as they stand at the moment. And in fact, after the crisis, one American expert said, well, what is it that banks keep trying to do that is making things so risky? Because in business, we often talk about how capitalism and markets lead to innovation and great ideas. But he suggested that actually since the ATM, so the hole in the wall machine where you take your cash out, banks haven't come up with a single innovation that has benefited society. All of their innovations are simply about moving the profits around and making the profits for the banks bigger and bigger and bigger by creating more complexity. So that's what we learned from the crisis. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of other really important things that occasionally crop up in the media but never get dealt with. And so some people will have heard the idea of a tax haven. Other people talk about a tax haven as a secrecy jurisdiction. The whole point of a tax haven is wealthy people and wealthy companies can put money there and they can hide it from the taxman. And it's estimated that there's probably upwards of 20 trillion US dollars. Again, an astonishing amount of money in tax havens. But nobody knows the true figures because nobody's keeping the data. Now, if you hear about tax havens on the news, probably they're talking about Panama or the Cayman Islands or some third world country. But in fact, the leading tax havens in the world are Britain, America, and Switzerland. And Britain is particularly important because London is at the center of a global network of tax havens throughout many of its former colonies and small islands and so on. And so the four major banks in Britain, so HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, and RBS, they actually have 1,600 subsidiaries in tax havens. Okay, so although whenever you see them advertising on telly or you see a spokesperson for one of these organizations being interviewed and discussing something, they seem like reasonable business who believe in the idea of the law. In fact, a great deal of what they do is about hiding other people's money and actually hiding their own money in tax havens away from the taxman. And what you'll discover is that when we talk about third world countries or developing countries, we often say, well, corruption is a problem in those countries. Well, in fact, corruption at the scale we're talking about, involving billions and billions of pounds and dollars, it cannot take place without the mainstream banking system participating and helping. Okay, so they really are active behind the scenes, helping fraudsters, helping criminals, and I do mean criminals, you know, people who are drug dealers, drug growers, and so on. They help them hide their money all over the world. And then there's a separate group of banks, which is important in Britain and in some other countries, which are private banks, and you'll always hear nothing about them. They're not publicly owned. They give very little information to anybody. But the 10 biggest private banks in Britain, they control over 4 trillion pounds. So again, a lot of that ends up getting stashed in tax havens. So another area of the banking system which people know very little about, which is active in helping criminals. Okay, so the mechanism by which rich people take their money out of a country and put it in a tax haven is known as capital flight. Now, the word capital often means different things to economists, but here we're just talking about money. So capital flight is rich people, many of them in poor countries, but not all of them, trying to hide their money. And what people who study this sort of thing have realized is that there is an enormous flow of wealth from poor countries to rich countries. So if you look at, say, in the mainstream media, there'll be a discussion about aid. And some British politician will turn up and say, well, yes, we've given £20 million of aid this year, and so on. But in fact, the amount of money that goes from poor countries to rich countries is much, much greater than that. It's estimated approximately $2 trillion US dollars a year go from poor countries to rich. And the single biggest cause of that wealth transfer from poor countries to rich is capital flight. So there was a very famous study, or perhaps notorious is a better word than famous. This was way back in 1979, but there's no reason to believe that the sort of mechanisms and the details have changed. And it was an analysis of Nicaragua. And the researchers found that 3/4 of the money that was loaned to Nicaragua immediately left the country and was stashed in the bank accounts of the rich and powerful who ran Nicaragua. And there's a very good researcher for anybody who's ever interested in looking at this in more detail, a guy called James Henry. And he wrote a great book. It's a few years old now, but all the information is still relevant. And it was called Blood Bankers. And he explained how in many poor countries, you've got a tiny group of people controlling most of the wealth. So in El Salvador, you have just 14 families controlling 9/10 of their land and their finance. And in Nicaragua, you have just one family controlling about 1/4 of the farming land that's usable for crops. So you've got these incredibly rich, powerful people, and many of them either are the government or are directly connected to the government, and they find all sorts of ways of taking money that really belongs to the people and wealth that belongs to the people and stashing it in their own private bank accounts. So this isn't just a case of bankers and companies pulling a fast one and working against the British, American, or the Swiss government. Right? The British, American, and Swiss governments are actively supportive of what's going on. Switzerland loves it, the fact that it is one of the world's leading tax jurisdictions. And every now and again, if you're sort of reading the news and you're alert and you're thinking about these things, there'll be an article saying that there was a whistleblower from a bank in Switzerland, and he tried to point out how criminal the bank that he worked at was being. Well, instead of the bank being prosecuted, these days it's always, in Switzerland, it's the whistleblower who's prosecuted. So the government actively protects the criminal activities of the banks and the people who use the banks and stash their money there. And to a lesser extent, the same is true in Britain and America. They could easily come up with regulations to stop this, but there are so many rich and powerful people in Britain and America who benefit from this system, who make donations to the politicians to say, these are the laws we want, these are the regulations we want, and the government is happy to oblige. And of course, there are people in the British government. It came out a few years ago that David Cameron has offshore bank accounts. And when the Panama papers came out, people discovered that just in this one kind of small legal office, there were loads and loads of rich and powerful people with a lot of money in offshore bank accounts. And one of the reasons that countries struggle with taxation issues is that because of what's happening with the tax havens. So if you look at a country like Greece, everyone's always saying, oh, Greece was in terrible trouble and had to do austerity because it was profligate. It spent too much money on too many lazy people and things like that. It's the standard story you read in the Daily Mail. But in fact, one of the main reasons Greece struggles is that they find it difficult to tax their tax evaders who keep stashing money offshore. And the same is true in other countries. It's estimated that probably there's maybe £16 billion a year of unpaid taxes in Britain that the rich and the powerful just hide offshore. And then this also applies in a more complex way with companies who engage in what's called transfer pricing. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the detail. The idea is that a company that has a division in Britain and a division in Africa can set up a division in Pan International, and they had a network of 800 offshore companies. So these were companies that were only existed to hide profits and to hide taxes. And it's estimated that hundreds of billions of pounds and dollars are lost in tax revenue every year because companies can engage in this system of what's called transfer pricing, so hiding their profits. And one of the world's leading authorities on the accountancy system, so a guy called Prem Sikka, who's now in the House of Lords, I think I may have mentioned him in passing on a previous occasion, he has pointed out that none of this could work without corrupt accountants. And that's the main accountancy firms. It's not some little fly-by-night guy in a secret office. It's the big accountancy firms that do the accounts for all the big companies. They somehow managed to miss a $7 billion bribe to Saudi Arabia. And they overlook when money is getting stashed in a tax haven and tax is not being paid. And they know it should be being paid. And various people have said, actually, the simple ways to deal with transfer pricing. In fact, there's a tax expert called Richard Murphy, who's well worth reading, and he's connected to the Tax Justice Network. And he's actually created a system where you would completely change the way companies report their taxes, which would eliminate this problem completely. And in fact, people are starting to talk about it seriously. People in positions of power are starting to talk about it seriously. So it one day may come about, but it hasn't really yet. And another thing that people have pointed out about many of the techniques that people who are doing tax avoidance or tax evasion do is that most of these things are never tested in court. So a lot of people have a very legalistic way of thinking about the law. They think this is the law, it's either legal or it's illegal, and it's very black and white. But in fact, most of the schemes that the accountants come up with to help tax avoiders and tax evaders are actually believed to be illegal by the people who create them, right? But they never get tested in court. And until they're tested in court, you can get away with it. And it's a question of whether the regulator has the manpower and the resources to go after these, because they would be going after many, many companies and people with power, and it would be a very, very big challenge to do that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the gambling side of banking, and this is where the numbers, we've talked about trillions already, and that's an amount of money that's incomprehensible. So a trillion is 1,000 billion. If you have 1,000 trillion, that's called a quadrillion. So unless you're a mathematician, all of these numbers become slightly irrelevant. They're just astronomical sums. The amount of money that is gambled in currency speculation each year is estimated to be approximately $2 quadrillion. This is many, many times bigger than the entire economy of the world. So this has nothing to do with, say, insuring a transaction on a ship which might get sunk at sea and making sure you don't lose money and so on. This actually is just gambling. So some people will be aware, some of the older listeners or viewers will be aware that in 1992, George Soros gambled on sterling, or he bet against sterling, and he made lots of money, and the British government lost lots of money because he was able to do gambling on the currency. And then something similar happened in 1997. There was lots of speculation in relation to various currencies, particularly in Asia. And they had the 1997 Asian currency crisis. And this was so dramatic for these countries that it's estimated that about 24 million jobs were lost in the space of 1 year. It was an astonishing consequence. So you can see that gambling on the financial system can have enormous negative impacts all over the world. And as well as gambling on currency, people can gamble with things called derivatives. And these have funny names like futures and options. And it's a way of gambling on what the future price of something that you can buy on the stock market might be, whether the price is going to go up, or you can make a profit by betting that it's going to go down and things like that. Now, Warren Buffett, one of the leading financial experts in the world, describes derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction. They can be so destabilizing. And in fact, in 2007, at the same time as the financial crisis, there was a huge amount of gambling on food and oil prices. And this affects the price of food in the third world, and it affects the price of oil all over the world. And the effects were so dramatic, it led to food riots in many poor countries. Okay, so all of this gambling by a handful of rich people looking at their computer screens has enormous negative impacts all over the world. Okay, there's a few more things that I could talk about, and I'll take a little break there, and we'll just see if people have got any questions. And if not, I'll spend another 5 or 10 minutes just talking about one or two more things that people might be interested in that are related to the system.
Thanks, Rod. That was really interesting. And I love the way you put your presentations across, because they're so easy to understand. I remember a film that Michael Moore did a few years back where he was talking about the financial crisis, and he went to Wall Street to interview workers as they were coming out, and he was asking them, what is a derivative? And nobody could explain to him what a derivative was, which was quite funny. And it's very pertinent that you brought that up. I have a question for you, Rod. During the last bank bailout, the government in Finland decided to jail their bankers and then have gone on to drive a successful and thriving economy. Why didn't our government jail the bankers instead of foisting austerity on the British people?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. And in fact, there's a famous documentary which was made about the crisis called Inside Job, and a chunk of that focused on Iceland, and they did something similar with their bankers. They actually locked them up afterwards, because what the bankers are doing is criminal, and there's no reason at all why Britain and America and every other country can't arrest and prosecute criminal corporate executives, and that includes bankers. No reason at all. We have laws that enable us to prosecute these people. What they're doing is a systematic form of fraud. I mean, fraud on a scale that you can't comprehend. And this is one of the great jokes that people often make. If you rob a store of £20, you'll be up before the magistrate, and there's a chance, depending on your history and so on, that you'll go to jail, right? If you steal £20 billion because you're in control of a bank, the worst that happens is that the bank gets a fine. But that's only under certain sets of circumstances. Often nothing happens, and no individual is prosecuted. And it's a sign, really, of just how corrupt our politicians have become. And it's a mixture of things. So one of the things is what's called ideological capture. So ideology is about what people believe. And unfortunately, politicians and even academics in Britain and America have completely bought into the mindset that what's good for business is good for Britain or is good for America. And so corporate profits are all they think about. And they completely ignore the criminal activities, the unethical activities, and the downsides for everybody else. They consider all of that to be less important. And it's just a question of us as a society saying we have to completely change this mindset. If a small country like, say, Finland or Iceland can do this, there's no reason why big countries can't do it. But at the moment, I see no sign of anyone really senior within the British or American governments wanting to do anything serious in relation to either the banks or in relation to corporate crime and unethical activity more generally. And there's so many different parts of the system which reinforce what's going on. So partly it's ideological, partly it's the fact that big companies pay big bribes to finance the politicians. And in America, this is enormous. Politicians get very rich from corporate funding. We have the same here, but to a lesser extent. But you still got an element of corruption built into the system, where banks or any other company or any other rich person can make these financial donations, and very quietly behind the scenes, regulations will get made to suit them. And then, of course, you've got the idea that when these people retire from politics, they will go and get good jobs with some of these business, or they will go and get good jobs with some of these lobbyists, and they will be very well paid. And of course, they're being rewarded for their service to these companies whilst they were in politics. So long as they were doing regulations that suited these companies, then they will be very, very well rewarded. So you have all these aspects of the system which actually motivate people to be corrupt. And you have no part of the system, there's no criminal penalties and so on, that are actually enforced that will actually deter any of these activities. So it's only by talking about these things and getting everybody to understand it, and then getting everybody to try and discuss how we might stop it in the fullness of time that anything will ever really change.
Indeed, and it's one of the things that many of our people on the chat and many of our members of the Resist movement often talk about is the corrupt politicians. And it's a big revolving door, isn't it, Rod? You go into politics, and then you maybe get a lordship, or You are talked around by these big lobbyists from these big corporations, giving handouts. And the Tory party in particular seem to like rewarding their donors with titles to be then go into the House of Lords. So we then have a second tier of governance within this country who are, I would say most of them are there just because they've given donations to the Tory party, who then in turn reward them with big government contracts and a title to go with it. It's infuriating. How do we stop this?
Well, so Chris asks me this every week, and I'm sad to say that I don't have any simple solutions. And oddly enough, I had a fascinating conversation at the weekend with a campaigner called Craig Murray, who was the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, and he exposed the torture going on in Uzbekistan, that the British government was using information from torture, and he tried to expose it, and he thought when he exposed it that the government would have nothing to do with the torture. In fact, it was the opposite. They were keen on the torture, and they tried to smear Craig Murray. And I was talking to him, and he was saying, you know, do we see a route forward? And it was between us. We saw no simple solutions, that so many aspects of the system are now so corrupt that it's really going to require a huge effort by an awful lot of people to very actively start campaigning and protesting. And of course, that's becoming more and more difficult with the recent bill saying you can't protest. And I actually find this quite shocking, in that if you look back at the history of social change, you know, take women's rights and women getting the vote and so on, you know, that came about because women actively campaigned, and there was the famous incident where one of the campaigners threw herself in front of the king's racehorse and so on. And without protest, we will never achieve serious change. You know, it's very, very difficult for anyone to have an avenue. So it does require that all of us essentially protest against the inability to protest. You know, that's the sort of new law that we must stop and we must work against and so on. And it's going to require a very large number of people to get active in politics and to start working together. I feel we're a bit, we're not united enough in terms of what we campaign on. And so I think over time, something, you know, people will coalesce, or groups will coalesce, and we'll work out some way to work together. But at the moment, that's not happening. And so everybody needs to do what they can, and we'll have to see what emerges.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we started the Resist movement in the first place. You know, we need to get all the groups together, all different organisations, campaign groups, and we need to start protesting against the same things like corrupt politicians. We need to be campaigning for the NHS. We just can't sit on our backsides any longer and wait for the leader of the opposition or the Labour Party to do something about it, because we know they won't.
I agree. There's something that I think is interesting, that if you look at the number of people who are interested in challenging the privatization of the NHS, and then you look at the number of people who are interested in campaigning about climate change, and the number of people campaigning about other things, and so on, there's an awful lot of people who are wanting to campaign about something. So it's about, I think, working out ways that we can start recognizing that actually these are not really separate topics. They're separate symptoms of the same underlying problems.
Absolutely.
And if we can start to work together, then, you know, who knows what we might bring about. You know, climate change happens because of the pollution and so on. And you look at what the oil companies do, and you look at what all the other polluting industries do, and you realize we've got to challenge those companies. And you look at the privatization of the NHS, and you realize it's driven by big American companies doing the lobbying and getting the laws rewritten behind the scenes and so on. And those are not separate issues. We've got to start putting these things together, joining the dots, and saying it's about taking power from the 1%, taking away corporate power, and not letting the mainstream media drive the debate and allow us to allow ourselves to be divided And when you look at certain issues, and I think the most obvious has been on identity politics, and about how people on the left can't agree on certain issues on the left. And there's lots of infighting and lots of squabbling. And actually, on most topics, those people would all agree with each other. And if we could stop squabbling about the things that the mainstream media is telling us to squabble about, ignore their agenda and work together on our agenda, then I think things might, we might have a chance. I think there's a lot of people would like the system to change a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, before we we're going to go over to Lizzie in a second to get some questions and comments from people in the chat room. Big hi to all our regulars over there: Mark, Atcha John, Kevin, Jonathan. I'm sure you're all there in the background somewhere and keeping Lizzie busy. Before we go over to Lizzie, I just want to remind people you can donate to us. Obviously, we put this broadcast out every week. We don't earn any money from it. We're all volunteers. The Resist movement is a volunteer and member-led movement, which you can join at resistmovement.org.uk, or you can maybe pay a donation towards the costs that we incur for putting out the Resistance TV show every week, which is paypal.me/Festival of Resistance. Okay, so can we go over to Lizzie now, please? Is she there? Lizzie, you're on mute.
I learned that.
Hi, how are you this evening? Is it going okay?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you all?
Yeah, great, thank you. So what's going on in our backroom chat tonight?
A lot of questions. You've answered a few of them while you've been talking, but I think a few stand out. Since ATMs, no innovations have come from banking. You talked about earlier, and haven't all innovations come from public funding, i.e. Kevlar was invented for the space station or the space race, and now it's used in armor.
So the innovations thing is a really good question, actually, that the mainstream presentation of capitalism about them being these risk-taking innovative organizations is a complete distortion of what reality is like. And in fact, Noam Chomsky is an outstanding writer on this, and he talks about what he calls really existing capitalism, which is the incredibly strong relationship between state-sponsored research, so it can be through universities funded by the government, and the eventual profits of big companies. And so, in fact, studies have been done. If you take an iPhone apart and look at all the important components inside, the memories, the processors, all sorts of things, apparently every one of those, or nearly every one of those, actually comes from government research. And the US government, I'm very critical of the US government about nearly everything, but one of the things it does amazingly well is state-funded research on technologies. It's brilliant. It's been doing computers and high-tech stuff for decades. And the problem at the moment is it then takes those technologies and hands them off to the private sector. It hands them to people like Bill Gates. And those people go off and make astronomical profits because they're effectively functioning like an extension of the government. And in fact, there was some research, I think I might have mentioned this in the first or second presentation, showing that if you look at where billionaires' wealth comes from, an enormous amount of it comes in industries that are very strongly supported by governments.
Yes.
And so they're taking the wealth of the nation and concentrating it into private hands. And so
it's the old story, isn't it? From the public purse to the private pocket.
That's right. Yes.
The next question was London, London City tax haven, has been exposed several times, like by Craig Murray, etc. You know, all the things have been exposed, but the story gets no traction. Then the media that broadcasts the story gets attacked in some way. What can we as individuals do? Can we create lists of the banks that are helping criminals?
Well, so that would be a very long list. I think that would probably be all of the major banks. So this is part of the problem. And this is one of the things you notice with sort of consumer campaigns, about saying, let's not buy from that shop. Let's find a more ethical place to go. Well, when you start digging below the surface, you realize it's very, very hard to find big ethical businesses.
Perhaps we ought to list those that are ethical then.
Well, yes, I think there are one or two organizations in each industry. So banking would be an example of that, where they are trying to come up with ethical banking ideas and so on. And so that is something that individuals can do. I haven't researched them in any depth. I've come across one or two names. So I think there was one called Triodos Bank, but if I've misremembered, and that's actually the most unethical one in the world, I apologize. But I think that probably was trying to be a bit more ethical and so on. So there are one or two, but it takes a lot of research, but it's worth doing if you feel you have the energy. And it would be good if there were organizations that are listing more ethical companies that members of the public can move to. And that's a small step that we could do. But there is a question mark over the media that they will sometimes highlight an issue, and they won't talk about it as a systemic problem. They'll say, oh, look, we've spotted this company doing, something illegal and so on. And what are we going to do? And they'll interview a minister, and the minister will say, well, yes, of course, this is a serious problem. We must do something about it. And then it disappears from the debate. Yeah. And I think the alternative media has an important role to play here. And the alternative media is just sort of in its infancy. But we really do have to take some of these topics. So I think corporate crime is the obvious one, and make sure they are front and center in our discussions all the time of what we need to change about our society, and get more and more people talking about a handful of really big, important issues. And I think eventually that puts a little bit of pressure on the mainstream media to start talking about it again, but to keep it in the media, to make it a subject for everyone.
Yes, well, nobody's managed to shut Craig Murray up yet, quite.
Not yet. So we'll wait and see. Fingers crossed.
He's facing a similar future to Julian Assange, I think.
Can I just mention that for people who don't know, Craig Murray may well be imprisoned for 8 months on a very, very weird technical charge in Scotland. And so we will have to wait and see what happens there.
And we've got lots of questions. Obviously, is cryptocurrency a solution? Well, that would take a program all by itself, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'm not going to touch on cryptocurrency today. It's not something I've researched in enough detail to be able to write a good guide. And I suspect there are quite a lot of unknowns about it. So it's a kind of watch this space, and we'll see where it goes.
The only thing that I've heard about it is that it costs far more to mine in CO2 emissions than it could ever benefit anybody. So, there's, like you said, it's such a dense subject. We couldn't possibly even discuss it in an entire program, let alone on the end of one, which we've got to stop early for the footy, apparently. So
it's the cricket. Yeah, I think the cricket.
Oh, is it the footy?
I've got one more quick question then, Lizzie.
Please, can you talk about odious debt? Who monitors the IMF and World Banks? Is it true only one person has been arrested for financial crimes because of the crash? Was Iceland the only country to deal with it? And are there gatekeepers in every campaign group making sure no one collaborates?
Ooh, which one? So the first 2 points, you were talking about odious debt and the World Bank. And in fact, what I've tried to do mostly in the last few presentations is talk about how things work in Britain. We've talked a little bit about sort of capital flight and tax havens and so on, but it sort of connects to Britain and the banking system. I'm going to do completely separate presentations on how the whole international economic system is structured to transfer wealth from poor to rich. So we can talk about that another day in a couple of months, probably. But I find that an equally fascinating subject, actually.
And people being pursued for financial crimes because of the crash and Iceland's part in it. Oh, and also an interesting fact, I don't know, perhaps everybody knows, that the Icelandic women did a one-day strike, which brought the country to its knees. And that's the sort of solution we should be looking for.
Now, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard of the Icelandic women story. But one of the things that I do feel very strongly is that I think women, if they worked together, could really make a difference to our societies. And it always seems odd to me that on any
That's
kind of...
why we're closed down and told that we are not as good as certain others.
Yeah, so I think there's a weird hijacking in the media of debates about feminism, and it's always about getting equal numbers of women into the top jobs. But if you're getting equal numbers of women into the top jobs in a world where men have made the rules, the women you're going to get in the top jobs are the most vicious, aggressive, cutthroat, brutal Hillary Clinton, Margaret Thatcher, and Angela Merkel, right? All
Priti
with a
Patel.
terrible... Pardon?
Priti Patel.
Priti Patel, right. So, I mean, the list is quite long. We need a different set of rules. And I think ordinary women, and ordinary men too, but ordinary women especially, need to recognize they could play a part in trying to create a fairer society with a completely different set of rules. But again, they need to start working together. And so, again, that would be a whole topic in itself. But I do think it is something that we need to make into a topic that people start talking about more, and so on. Because I think that is where change will come from in the fullness of time.
Well, I think it already is. There's a lot of us women in the media and in organisations that are starting to network and to collaborate. The trouble is, of course, that there are gatekeepers in most campaign groups and most institutions and organisations. There are gatekeepers making sure that those events, that those ideas aren't fulfilled, that those ideas aren't even heard. Absolutely,
yeah. So I think it's a question of. So I think a one-day woman strike is a wonderful idea. And so if women actually sat down and talked about what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, and then thought about that type of thing, I think things could change really quickly.
Well, and Iceland being the only country that prosecuted all the people responsible for the banking crash, and people that had invested in Iceland through their pension plans, etc. Corporates, councils, they repaid all of those, didn't they?
They did. Yes.
Okay, you guys seem to know more about how much they repaid than I do, but that may be the case. I'd have to go and get some data to be sure.
Yeah, we'll talk more about Iceland.
Guys, thank you very much for joining us, Lizzie. We're going to have to finish there, unfortunately. We never have enough time at the end for questions. But thank you for moderating this evening, and it's lovely to see you back. So see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully. Just quickly before we go, I know before we came on air, we were chatting briefly backstage about a letter that you'd sent to some judges regarding the Julian Assange case. Would you like to tell our viewers about that?
Yes. So I'm an active campaigner for Julian Assange because I believe he's been very unfairly treated. He's basically been persecuted, and he's been ruled that he cannot be extradited to America, and yet he's still in Belmarsh maximum security prison. Now, the detail of the way he's been treated by the judges has been so extreme that at the end of last year, I actually wrote some reports to the police. So I filled in some crime reports about misconduct in public office by 3 judges and 1 prosecutor. And I provided them with an update recently because of some new information, and that's kind of ongoing. But I'm hoping that over time, here on Resistance TV and other places too, we can start to talk a little bit about his case, and also about judges not being fair and not being unbiased, and about the need for the police to seriously investigate their behaviour, particularly in relation to Julian Assange. Although I think there might be also an argument in relation to Craig Murray, but my focus for the time being is on their behaviour in relation to Julian Assange. So I will keep people posted on that, and perhaps next week I'll post some links if people are interested, and they can take a look at a more detailed version of that, so they know what's going on.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Rod, and thank you again for tonight's episode. If you want to read more about the subject that Rod has been talking about this evening, you can look at Rod's blog, The Elephant in the Room, and the link is available on the description down below. Chris will be back next week, and we'll see you at the same time Wednesday at 7 p.m. Please subscribe, click the thumbs up button, and hit that icon bell for further notifications. If you'd like to leave us a message in comments, we'd love to read your feedback and suggestions for future broadcasts. So thank you once again, and good night.